The history of inequality in South Africa. South Africa is often called the Rainbow Nation, a land filled with incredible diversity, breathtaking landscapes, and cultures that have survived for centuries. But beneath the beauty lies a story that is far more complicated, a story of inequality. This inequality was not created in a single moment. It was built slowly, layer by layer, across generations, and it continues to shape the lives of millions of South Africans today. To understand where it began, we have to travel back long before Europeans arrived. For thousands of years, people lived on this land. The San and Khoi moved with the seasons, hunting, gathering, and herding their animals. Later, African kingdoms rose in power, the Mapungubwe, and later the great Zulu and Xhosa nations. These communities had leaders, traditions, and systems of trade. There were social differences, but land and resources were generally shared, and people's lives were tied closely to their families, clans, and communities. Inequality, as we know it today, was not yet carved into society. That changed in the 1652, when the Dutch East India Company set up a small settlement at the Cape of Good Hope. At first, it was only meant to be a refreshment station for ships passing along the trade routes, but slowly it grew into something larger. Dutch settlers, known as Boers, began farming the land, claiming it as their own. Indigenous Khoi and San people were pushed off their ancestral lands. Slavery was introduced, with enslaved people brought from East Africa, Madagascar, and even as far away as Indonesia and India. Within just a few decades, power and land were being taken from local communities and concentrated in the hands of settlers. The arrival of the British in the 1800s only deepened this imbalance. The British brought new laws, new rulers, and new wars. The frontier wars between the Xhosa and the settlers raged for decades, destroying lives and tearing apart communities. Many African farmers lost their land, forced instead to work for wages on farms they once owned. This was the beginning of dispossession, a theme that would dominate South Africa's history. Then came the discovery that would change everything. Diamonds in Kimberley in 1867 and gold in Johannesburg in 1886. Almost overnight, South Africa became one of the richest territories in the world. But that wealth did not lift everyone. To dig out the diamonds and gold, mine owners needed labor. African men were drawn into the mines, often forced by law or poverty to leave their families behind and live in crowded, controlled compounds. They worked long hours in dangerous conditions for wages that barely kept them alive. White settlers and foreign investors grew incredibly wealthy, while the majority of South Africans remained trapped in poverty. This economic system was no accident. Laws were designed to keep African workers dependent and powerless. The infamous 1913 Land Act banned Black South Africans from owning land in most of the country, forcing them into reserves that made up only a fraction of South Africa's land. This one law alone shaped generations, ensuring that wealth, farming, and property ownership stayed in white hands. By the mid-20th century, inequality had been built into almost every aspect of life. And in 1948, the National Party took things even further. They introduced apartheid, a system of laws that made racial segregation official government policy. Under apartheid, South Africans were divided into racial groups: white, black, colored, and Indian. These groups determined where you could live, what job you could have, and even which schools your children could attend. Black South Africans were denied the right to vote. They were forced into so-called homelands, pieces of land that were often dry, overcrowded, and without resources. To move outside these areas, they needed to carry passbooks, small documents that controlled their every step. Education for Black children was deliberately limited by the Bantu Education Act, which trained them for low-paying jobs and left little room for advancement. White South Africans controlled almost all land, wealth, and political power. Black South Africans, who made up the majority, were turned into second-class citizens in their own country. But oppression also sparked resistance. From the 1950s onwards, brave men and women rose up against apartheid. They organized protests, strikes, and campaigns of civil disobedience. The African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress, and many other movements worked tirelessly for freedom. Leaders like Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Albertina Sisulu, and Steve Biko gave voice to the struggle. Many were jailed, tortured, or even killed, but the movement only grew stronger. The 1976 Soweto uprising was a turning point. Thousands of school children took to the streets, protesting against being forced to learn in Afrikaans. Police opened fire, killing hundreds. The images of young people like Hector Peterson shocked the world and fueled global outrage. International pressure began to mount. Countries imposed sanctions, musicians and athletes boycotted South Africa, and the apartheid government found itself increasingly isolated. Decades of resistance, both inside and outside the country, finally forced change. In 1990, Nelson Mandela was released after 27 years in prison. 4 years later, South Africa held its first democratic election. Millions of people lined up to vote for the first time in their lives. Nelson Mandela was elected the first black president of South Africa, and apartheid officially ended. For a moment, it felt like a new dawn. The dream of equality seemed within reach. But history leaves deep scars. The legacy of apartheid and centuries of dispossession did not vanish overnight. Land ownership remains unequal, with much of the country's farmland still in white hands. Many black South Africans continue to live in townships and informal settlements, with limited access to clean water, electricity, and health care. Education and employment gaps persist, and South Africa continues to have one of the widest income divides in the world. Today, inequality is not just about race, but also about wealth. A small percentage of South Africans control the majority of resources, while millions live in poverty. Corruption, unemployment, and slow land reform have made the road to true equality much harder. Yet, despite these challenges, South Africa is also a place of resilience. Its people continue to push for justice, for fair opportunities, and for a better future. The history of inequality in South Africa is not just a story of pain. It is also a story of survival, of courage, and of hope. From the sand hunters to the freedom fighters of Soweto, from the mines of Johannesburg to the ballot boxes of 1994, South Africans have shown again and again that they will not stop fighting for dignity. This story is not over. The struggle against inequality continues. And perhaps the greatest challenge of South Africa today is not only to remember its painful past, but to build a future where all its people can truly share in the promise of freedom.